Now, anger and frustration mounting over the Israeli leadership following the deaths of 6 hostages in Gaza, prompting thousands to take to the streets across Israel. Protesters are accusing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government of not doing enough to secure a ceasefire deal that would free the remaining captives. Over the weekend, the bodies of 6 hostages were recovered from a tunnel in the southern Gaza city of Rafah. They were reportedly killed shortly before being found by Israeli troops. Israel's labor court has ordered an end to the nationwide strike, which brought parts of the country to a standstill, including flights into and out of Ben Gurion Airport, the country's main air transport hub. Other transport services like bus and train services were also impacted. The head of Israel's Trade Union Federation, which represents hundreds of thousands of workers, had called for the strike to pressure the government into signing a hostage deal with Hamas. U.S. President Joe Biden, along with Vice President Kamala Harris, are set to meet the U.S. negotiating team to push for a hostage release deal later tonight. Now, Washington, together with Egypt and Qatar, has spent months pushing for a hostage prisoner exchange and ceasefire, but efforts have been repeatedly stalled by the warring parties. On the ground in Gaza, at least 11 Palestinians were killed after Israeli strikes hit a school sheltering displaced people. The fighting coincides with the second day of localized humanitarian pauses to facilitate a UN-led polio vaccination drive after the first confirmed case in 25 years. The UN says some 87,000 children have received their first dose of polio vaccine, with the goal of vaccinating 640,000 Palestinian children below the age of 10. While Israel and Hamas have agreed to brief pauses in their ongoing conflict, safety concerns remain as military drones are reportedly continuing to hover over the region. Now, for more, we're joined by Sarah Coates reporting live from Tel Aviv. Sarah, tell us more about the protests and the extent of the labor strikes that's happening today.
Hello there, Glenda. That official strike coming to a grinding halt after that court ruling. We've heard from the head of Israel's labor union. He's told people to get back to work, saying we live in a state of law. Now, given this injunction, it is fairly unlikely that this strike had as much impact as these organisers really had hoped for. The international airport, Ben Gurion Airport, it was only closed for a couple of hours. Shops are beginning to open their doors. So what we're really seeing now on the streets are continued protests, people doing things like blocking roads, holding placards. We do, of course, have seen police forcibly dragging people off the roads, arresting others. And we are hearing reports of some violence erupting between demonstrators and police, but really nothing that was on the same scale as what we saw last night here in Tel Aviv. Hundreds of thousands of people marching, calling for the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to do a deal immediately to release these remaining hostages from the Gaza Strip. These protests last night often turning violent, with authorities using things like water cannons to disperse protesters. And we do understand, according to organisers of this protest overnight, that some of these people that were arrested are still being held, Glenda.
Well, you mentioned there a little impact, but, how has the Israeli government reacted to the demonstrations? And, has it made any inroads, perhaps, into pressuring the government to perhaps maybe agree to a ceasefire deal here?
Well, what we are hearing from a couple of ministers is defiance. These are far right-wing ministers, specifically the Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich. He has come out praising the ruling of this Labour court. He said, we won't allow harm to the Israeli economy, saying that the protests serve the interests of Hamas. And Yahya Sinwar, he is the head of Hamas now since the death, of course, of Ismail Haniyeh. We've also heard from his counterpart in the government, that is the far-right National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. he's come out to talk about this ceasefire deal or any kind of proposal. He said that he's using his power in the government to prevent what he's calling a reckless deal and to stop negotiations altogether. Now, while most of these protests are really being directed at the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself, we haven't actually heard from him about today's strike action. But what we did hear is some leaks that he said to his security cabinet late yesterday. And this is telling ministers that a deal would be a reward for terrorism, saying it would send a dangerous message to Hamas. So certainly a lot of anger here on the ground in what is really being seen as the government's refusal to get these captives out of Gaza, Glenda.
All right, thanks for that. Sarah Coates is speaking to us live from Tel Aviv.